Great. Thank you all so much for joining us. This is our second in our new series of navigating market access with Magnolia. We have brought together other members of our team. For those who joined last month, we talked about the Inflation Reduction Act and how patients are being affected by it and what manufacturers can do to help prepare patients for all of the changes. This month, we picked a topic that has become a pretty big deal. We've had a lot of clients asking questions about this in terms of how do we better meet the needs of what we're being asked by payers while we're having our clinical and contracting discussions. So we are going to dive into that today. We have two lovely members of the Magnolia Market Access team that will be presenting. If we can just go to the next slide, please. So Becky Roman, who is with us, who is a pharmacist and has been working in the payer world for over a decade. She has joined us today. I always start these things off by saying payers are people too, right? And it's really great to have her here because not only does she see it from the side of the manufacturer, she also sees it from the side of the payer. So she's going to talk today about her experiences working with payers and or as a payer and working with manufacturers. And then we're also being joined by our Senior Vice President of RWE and HEOR Strategy, Pamela Landsman-Blumberg, who can talk a bit about the evidence burden and how that's growing and how things are changing in the world right now as payers are starting to scrutinize formularies more and more and thinking about managing costs. I know we've got a lot of big changes coming in the next few years, especially, and the way that our world works in the pharma space. So without further ado, I will hand it over to them. If you have questions, you can type them to the host and panelists throughout the presentation. I'll be sure to kind of field those as we go. And then we also will hold some time at the end for Q&A. Becky, the floor is yours.
All right. Thanks, Amanda. And thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. So today we are going to be focused on really new strategies for handling payer objections. We'll start off by reviewing some background information on changes within the payer market and how that presents both challenges as well as opportunities. And then we'll talk about the importance of developing a strong payer value proposition and general strategies for preparing for objections that will arise. And then finally, we will walk through several case scenarios and talk about data-driven strategic opportunities to successfully handle those objections. All right, so let's begin by talking about this changing payer marketplace. So over the past 20 years, we have really witnessed significant, what we're calling horizontal consolidation of pharmacy benefit managers or PBMs. So earlier in the month, the FTC issued an interim report on PBMs. And within the report, the graphic on the left side shows pretty clearly how what was numerous PBMs back in 2000 have really consolidated to now what is commonly called the big three. So CVS Caremark, Express Scripts, and Optum. And when we look at those three PBMs, they are processing nearly 80% of prescription drug claims. When you look at the next three by volume, 94% of claims are being managed by 6 PBMs. In more recent years, we've started to see this increasing vertical integration of the pharmaceutical supply chain, and this has resulted in the creation of these large healthcare conglomerates. We see the largest PBMs integrated within the largest insurers, and they are operating their own mail order as well as specialty pharmacies. And in one PBM's case, they also have the largest retail pharmacy chain. The FTC also had in their report that 70% of specialty pharmacy revenue is affiliated within those big three that we talked about earlier. In addition, these large healthcare companies also have provider services, and they have formed group purchasing organizations, sometimes referred to as rebate aggregators, that negotiate with drug manufacturers. So clearly there are challenges for drug manufacturers with consolidation and integration. The creation of GPOs have really created a lot of increased negotiation pressure. And with the majority of pharmacy claims really going through 3 PBMs, getting added to a major PBM's formularies excluded drug list or having really restrictive PA criteria can significantly impact access of the product. However, there are some positives associated with increased integration. So while PBMs were maybe historically or probably stereotypically associated as not being interested in the impact of pharmaceuticals on total cost of care, now that they're part of this larger health care umbrella, along with health plans, that are very interested, of course, in lowering medical costs. I expect that this will focus on total cost of care may become increasingly important. In addition, instead of looking at like pieces of the system, through integration, it's possible to see that interaction between the parts with more connected systems. And this could result in better data that cross-links provider service information, medical data, as well as pharmacy claims. So while there are big changes in the market and they're presenting challenges, payers are also feeling their own pressures, which impacts their perspective on drug coverage and reimbursement. So we all know providing coverage of healthcare is super complicated, and this is not intended to really be an all-encompassing list, but I wanted to briefly touch on today 5 payer concerns that payers may have regarding drug benefits. So affordability of healthcare is always a hot topic, and continued affordability of very high cost drugs and biologics is top of mind, for payers. So the graph here is showing FDA approvals of new molecular entities, either under new drug applications, NDAs, or under biologic license applications, BLAs. And 2023 was a big year with 55 novel approvals. But I want to just call out that this number doesn't include other therapeutics, that are coming to market. So think about like the 5 gene therapies that were approved last year, one of which cost over $4 million. It doesn't include other things like new cellular therapies, vaccines, or even biosimilars. And it's not just new products that drive affordability concerns for payers. We have new formulations coming out, expanded indications of already approved products. And then sometimes there's these unexpected market events or even social media driven spikes in use, as we saw with like the GLP-1 products. And then of course, there's other healthcare trends that impact drug use that are on payers' minds, such as increasing prevalence of various medical conditions in the aging population. So again, these 55 products are just that. There's other things that go into it. But when we look at them, we can see that over a third of them were first-in-class therapies. So that could represent new spend for plans. And then over half of these novel drugs were orphan designated, so used in rare disease, which generally means they come with a pretty high price tag. And these trends are expected to continue to grow more high-cost products. And on the commercial side of the business, employer groups are very concerned about drug costs in the pipeline. So there's a lot of pressure on payers to closely manage these therapies to keep their plans affordable. So clinical value, payers are always examining the clinical value of products when new products come to market to evaluate for coverage and management. And over the last 3 years, we have seen significant numbers of products that utilize the FDA's expedited development and review pathways. And these pathways are intended to encourage and expedite drugs that treat serious conditions and address unmet medical needs. So, good things, right? However, there are concerns out there that are voiced about the limited data that's available or the lack of longer-term data, as well as potential risks or harms to patients. In fact, there was a study published in Lancet earlier this year that looked at oncology drugs and indications that were granted accelerated approval and found that only 43% demonstrated clinical benefit. So that means overall survival and quality of life benefit within 5 years of approval. So when payers hear this kind of information, it can make them skeptical sometimes of products that are using that pathway. And then on the right side, we have clinical unknowns or open questions that payers are considering and looking for answers to when they're evaluating products. So they're concerned about how applicable this is to the populations not included in the clinical trial. The next 2 points are when, there's multiple treatment options available and clinical practice guidelines aren't available. What do we use first? If they work differently, can they be used in combination together? And another unknown, of course, that's getting a lot of attention recently is how durable is the effect of the product, especially with the one-time, gene therapies. Treatment success is always, questioned. How do you know the product is working if it slows disease progression, for example? And is the endpoint that's used in the trial applicable to clinical practice? And then, of course, what everybody wants to know is there head-to-head data? Is there comparative data to look at these products? So increasingly, payers are focused on ensuring that their members have equitable access to care. So to echo what Amanda said earlier, payers are people too, right? They are in the healthcare business and really do want to ensure that people get the treatment that they need. And so another potential benefit of vertical integration could be this increased focus on equitable care and a more holistic approach to solutions. So if you look at all of the major insurers and PBMs, they talk openly about work that they are doing towards health equity. Some specifics could include just like looking at to ensure that provider and pharmacies are accessible, to their members. Other things they're considering is how potentially like benefit design could impact prescription abandonment. So not going and, getting your prescription at the pharmacy at all, or not being adherent due to high out-of-pocket costs. I'm also thinking about and trying to address the affordability concerns of patients. So especially those patients who have multiple medical conditions and, many medications, and those costs really add up. And the last two concerns I'll just briefly touch on, and that's regarding adverse selection. So from a drug coverage perspective, in the marketplace or with Medicare, for example, payers are attempting to balance offering a comprehensive formulary without having too broad of coverage. They're also managing an increasing number of regulations regarding all aspects of their plan offering at both the state and federal level. So with a decreasing number of payers due to horizontal consolidation and increasing complexity of payer demands and concerns from vertical consolidation or integration, providing a strong value prop is critical for market access success. So I took a look at a 2019 survey of US and non-US managed care representatives, and they rated factors that are utilized in assessing the value of products. And payers consistently rated clinical benefit, improvement in health outcomes as high, while convenience-related or quality of life factors were rated lower. Another interesting finding from the study was that US payers do not have consistent or formal definitions of value, or have formal assessment processes to determine value for pharmaceutical processes. So there was consistency about some general processes in place, such as a P&T committee that takes a look at efficacy and safety and then makes a decision based on, if coverage will be provided because it's medically necessary. And then there's also things like value committees that can be used to assess cost. So budget impact, the cost effectiveness of a therapy, in addition to looking at the clinical efficacy and safety. And then those value committees will make decisions around access. So what's the tier, the step edits, prior authorization, et cetera. And then those committees typically provide guidance to the teams that do negotiations and contracting with manufacturers. So therefore, it's getting impactful value messages to those payer groups is critical to aid in their assessment and decision-making process. So the key components of a value proposition for payers really boils down to clinical benefit or efficacy and cost. There's other components, of course, such as safety, tolerability, dosing, what's the route of administration. Those are all really more impactful for healthcare providers compared to payers. So how do payers then weigh cost versus clinical benefit or efficacy within their value committees? So this matrix was published by Dr. Student, and it really helps to simplify a very complicated process in showing how cost versus efficacy can be decided based on really two forces. So on the x-axis, we have what is the unmet need in a condition. Kind of on the left or towards the zero is when there's comparable treatment options available. There's therapies out there. Moving more out to the right, where there's really no treatment available at all, and life and death hangs in the balance. On the y-axis, we have the driving force that is around what is the efficacy of the current standard of care and what value to the standard of care does this product bring. So towards the zero, we have that the product offers no to minimal gain in efficacy. And moving up the axis, there are gains in efficacy that are viewed as clinically significant. So when we look at these four different quadrants, the products that fall into that bottom left quadrant, where there's other treatments available and really a minimal gain in efficacy, cost is going to drive the value proposition. Examples of this may be reformulated products, moving from a twice a day to a once a day, or even what could be viewed as like a significant decrease in frequency. So going from every 2 weeks to every 8 weeks can be viewed as convenience, and cost will really be the primary driver. When we look at that upper left quadrant, these are products that may offer additional efficacy benefits, but there's a lot of treatment options available. Cost is still generally going to be the primary driver for payers. In this scenario, there's other therapeutic alternatives indicated. They have efficacy. So think about products like even for hypertension or high cholesterol as an example. Lower cost options may be in a preferred status over higher cost, even if the higher cost products may have some perceived efficacy benefits. So when we look at the right side of the matrix, this is where there is an unmet need in the condition. In both scenarios, efficacy is really going to be the primary driver for a value prop. The difference between the upper and the lower quadrant is what's the value of that clinical outcome. In the bottom right, maybe it's a value of less significance according to the assessment. Maybe it's a laboratory value that's used for the outcome versus the upper right, where it may be a harder clinical outcome like hospitalizations, overall survival. So the intention of showing this was that a matrix can really help determine the priority, efficacy versus cost, in developing a payer value proposition. So here we have detailed the key steps in the process for creating a value proposition. First is you create your potential messages, focusing on some of those high priority areas and drivers that we were just talking about. So it's the burden of illness, the unmet needs that we talked about, what's the clinical benefit of the product, what's its efficacy gains, and then of course the price or the economic impact. Then you determine what your key messages are going to be, develop that initial value proposition, and then gaining early feedback on those messages from payers is important to identify problem areas and make any revisions that might be needed. Another step in the process is gaining alignment across your organization, right? Making sure all the different teams are aligned to the proposition that's being out there. And then through payer feedback, or even during that alignment process, you may identify new evidence needs. And then finally, you want to have an external communication strategy to support your launch. But even with the strong value proposition, payers will have objections. And what we mean by objections are questions or sometimes just posing challenges about the value of the product that may impact if or how they provide coverage. So here we have some general ways to handle objections that first include just, being prepared. And this is really, can be part of the value proposition development. But what are the common questions that you will be asked? You can develop a list from your earlier payer research, also through just internal brainstorming. But you have to understand what you have answers for, and then practice, of course, is always a key part of being prepared. It's really important to, when you go into talk with payers, that you know who they are and what role they have in the organization. So we talked earlier about P&T, value assessment or formulary design, contract negotiations, like what are they doing in there? Because that will help you understand potentially what types of questions will be asked. So are they writing the coverage policy? Are they leading the contract negotiations? Those different roles, may help you have an idea of the types of objections that will be raised. And then finally, if you're joining a crowded class or there's other treatment options, knowing your competition, what unmet needs do they not address? And what is their, value proposition? You also want to really listen to what the payer is asking. Make sure you understand the question before trying to answer with a lot of information. And know that there's usually more behind the question than just curiosity. For example, if they are asking about inclusion and exclusion criteria, the payer may be thinking about potential coverage limitations to the studied population only. Or if they're asking details about the endpoints used, especially if it's like a functional type of test, for example, or some sort of rating scale, they may be thinking about how they could use that endpoint as part of reauthorization criteria. The next one on here may be obvious, but that's be honest and direct. Answer the question directly with the data that you have and have awareness around what's under investigation currently. And then finally, have a collaborative mindset. So obviously, manufacturers have their goals and objectives, but ask the payer what they think. What value does this product bring to the market? What other information do they need in their assessment? And if they are throwing up a bunch of challenges or roadblocks, it's important to just work with them to understand their needs, what additional information they could use, and then develop potential solutions around that. So obviously, these are all pretty, general types of things. And so what we really want to talk about for the rest of our time together is about how to evolve objection handling. We're going to walk through a few fictitious but not really uncommon case examples, and then talk about data-driven responses that could be considered when payers raise objections. So our first case we'll talk about is the crowded class. So in this case, there is a new formulation of a product that is launching. So the previous version of this product could only be administered by a healthcare provider. The new formulation allows for self-administration. So this is not only a crowded class in that now we have multiple types of formulations, but there's actually other therapeutic options available for the condition. These other options are self-administered, but sometimes, they don't work as well for everybody, and some of them have higher adverse reactions associated with them, which may make them not as attractive. So when we think about the unmet needs that are out there, obviously there's numerous treatment options available, other self-administered options. So this isn't really, meeting something unmet here. And there's the standards of care. It's really just providing another formulation. Clinical data-wise, it's equal in terms of safety and efficacy, but they do have increased quality of life and treatment satisfaction with the new formulation. From a price perspective, it's priced at parity with the previous formulation, and then other options that are out there are priced a little bit lower. So when we think about that matrix grid that I reviewed, this is going to be in that like lower left quadrant. It's not adding greater efficacy. It's not meeting an unmet need. So the price really will be the primary driver here. But there may be data-driven solutions to position the potential value of this product compared to the other therapeutic options. And I'll turn it over to Pam to walk through those.
Thank you, Becky. So one of the things Becky mentioned at the beginning is, this is the payer questions and how they evaluate new products put on formulary are evolving. One thing you'll see sort of with what we're listing as data-driven solutions is sometimes the questions don't change. The solutions, however, may be either solutions you've provided before, or they may be what we'll call new and evolving solutions. So, so first, obviously in a crowded class, they're going to want to know, is there any data comparing this to other options? In all likelihood, you have not done a head-to-head trial. So you might want to think about doing an indirect treatment comparison. So you take your clinical trial data, you look at the literature for the clinical trial data of your competitors, and you can utilize a different number of methods and sort of mock a head-to-head trial and offer that up. We had already said this question around, does that better side effect profile, which we had noted that it would have, result in improved adherence and persistence. So you could look at the literature for another product that might have a similar profile to use as what you expect to see. You might also modify a model, right? So that you may see adherence and persistence from some of the other competitors, but if they have poorer side effects, you can model how you think the improved side effect profile will impact that adherence or persistence. You also could offer to do a study, maybe even with that payer, where you follow patients forward. So as they are prescribed, follow them forward and utilizing either a claims analysis or even an EMR analysis on the actual adherence and persistence that you're seeing. What's the success of this product in those who failed other therapeutic options? You want to, possibly consider that during your clinical trial design. So a lot of these solutions that we're saying will also, you really need to want to start thinking about this early. You don't really want to have sort of a just in time or just when you're developing your value prop. So you might want to consider who you're including in your trial. Is it going to be new starts? Are these people who are treatment naive? Do you want to include people who have had treatment failures? You also could look at the claims data, potentially look at current treatment patterns, and look at what is the size possibly of a treatment resistance population. And then again, sort of model and expect, what do you think, where do you fit in that? Finally, again, a question on cost. How is this going to impact medical costs compared to other therapeutic options? One thing you can do is people will collect healthcare resource utilization within the trial. So what else, what care maybe the patient is seeking outside of the trial, but also what you're going to capture during the trial. And then you can actually apply costs either from claims data using the CPT codes, or you can apply, if it's a Medicare population, maybe you want to utilize the payments that you know that are posted that physicians would receive. You also might want to utilize a cost effectiveness model where you again can kind of change your assumptions around what are the cost savings of having those reduced adverse events. Becky, back to you for the next example.
All right, thanks, Pam. All right, so with case study 2, we're talking about here now we have an additional treatment option, but it varies a little bit in that it's not truly a crowded class. So in this case, we have a biologic product that we'll call new that received FDA approval to treat a condition that we'll just call Y. And it is administered subcutaneous once a week and doesn't have any special monitoring requirements associated with it. So this varies a little bit from the other 2 products that are currently on the market. Product 1, or kind of the first to market, is an IV product given every 3 months. Its kind of con is that it does require that it's administered not just in, by a healthcare provider, but actually in a monitored setting due to the risk of something like anaphylaxis, so severe reactions. And then product 2 is self-administered sub-Q every 2 weeks. Kind of its monitoring drawback, though, is it does require just routine laboratory monitoring every other week for the first couple months of therapies. So this is a situation where actually all 3 products, they're treating the same condition, but they're going about it differently. So they have different mechanisms of action that are out there. So when we think about unmet needs and what is this product adding? So the no monitoring requirements that we mentioned, as well as providing another mechanism of action for treatment. When we look clinically at these products and the data that they have, this product, similar to the other 2 products, uses an improvement in a standardized score that is related specifically to this condition, and they compared it to placebo, so not the other products that are out there, and they looked at a 12-month time frame. So when we look at the pricing for this product, it's a higher cost product, right? So this product has a little bit of a premium price at $350 a year, $350K a year. Product 1 is $300,000 a year. Product 2, $275,000. So to summarize, all of these products have efficacy. We have nothing directly comparing them, and they do work differently from each other. We can see with product new, it does have administration kind of advantages and the lack of monitoring requirements, which healthcare providers may really value. But payers, again, are probably going to look at this as being cost being a primary driver. And this product, like I mentioned before, is priced at a premium. So what are some common objections that payers will raise? And what are some data points that we can use to address? With that, I'll turn it back over to Pam.
Thank you, Becky. So one of the big questions is, can the products be used in combination? So one thing you might want to look at, even go back to your development folks, and is there any possibility that there might be drug-drug interactions, or what sometimes we call drug-disease interactions? So what is that profile of those other products? Are they contraindicated in certain diseases since they have different mechanisms of action that yours does not have, or that yours also has that, or might exacerbate possibly the contraindicated condition in the other product? So if not, again, you might want to do something else. This might be an add-on trial to start looking at combination therapies, or if physicians themselves are trying to use certain products in combination. What's the right sequence? So if they're not used in combination, would these be used in sequence in any way for let's say that you were starting with you're either starting with product 1 or product 2 as first line, and your product might be used as second or possibly even third line. So you want to look at what are the clinical practice guidelines that are out there. Sometimes in the guidelines, guidelines will not necessarily tell you exactly which line, but they'll tell you things to consider about a product, even in general, for a first line or a subsequent line of treatment. You want to maybe do a systematic literature review. Maybe this is already somebody, there's from the other products already, there's some information out there on sequencing that you can utilize. The other thing is maybe you're actually talking to maybe a provider group or professional society, and to start developing some treatment pathways as to when is the optimal time to use the new therapy. What is this impact on medical costs compared to other therapeutic options? As we mentioned before, some sort of cost analysis on your trial data, but you also want to account for all possible cost offsets in your budget impact model. So it might be very obvious for product 1, which has a risk of anaphylaxis, that you're going to take anaphylaxis and the costs of that into account. But the other product 2 has a higher burden on laboratory monitoring. So while you may think a lab test is somewhat of an insignificant cost, if you have to have regular monitoring, it's also, while payers don't always think about sort of burden on the patients, are they going to be able to get to either their provider or to, let's say, a Quest or a LabCorp office to have that monitoring done. So you want to make sure you don't forget about those. It's not just the hospitalizations or the procedures or the emergency department visits that can provide cost offsets. And again, do you stop the therapy if patient has no improvement? Maybe you look at a subgroup analysis in your trial of your non-responders. So what did they look like? Do they look different than your responders in any way? The other thing is, what is your measure of improvement? Often Becky had mentioned that use the same outcome measurement or tool as was used in the previous 2, but that tool or score may not be utilized in standard clinical practice. So you want to think about surrogate endpoints. And again, early on in your trial, an example I will use is often when clients have come to me around antidepressant treatments, they want to know if we have Hamilton D scores in our EMR. Well, you can find Hamilton D score in your EMR, but if you look closely, it's coming from patients who are covered by plans or within integrated delivery networks where they're reporting HEDIS scores. Otherwise, Hamilton D is either not collected or not reported. So it's very important to have that information as well, that maybe it's a different you want to think about a different outcome to say whether a patient has improved or not. Becky?
All right, we have our last case. So this is a novel therapy. So in this case, we're looking at a product that is administered by IV every 3 months, and it's for a rare genetic neuromuscular condition. It did go through the FDA's accelerated approval pathway. In this case, for standards of care, which also translates to the unmet needs, then there's no other FDA-approved treatment available. People will use steroids, immune globulin like IVIG has been tried in the past, but doesn't have much efficacy. So there's really nothing else available that is, disease modifying or impacting this condition. So in terms of just a little more information about this fictional genetic condition, it is a variable clinical presentation. So there's 3 different types that a patient can present with. Type 1 is, very rapidly progressing with death in 5 years, typically. Type 2 is a slower progression, milder symptoms, but eventually the symptoms do progress enough so that death occurs within, say, 20 years. And then type 3 is a very mild to no symptom presentation. They estimate the prevalence of this condition to be around 50,000 in the US. So how this product received FDA approval was by demonstrating improvement in inflammatory markers at a 6-month time point in patients who specifically have type 1. However, the FDA indication is broader. It just doesn't specify specific type. It's just indicated for the condition. And then from an economic data perspective, the price of this product is weight-based. And so it ranges anywhere from $750,000 to $900,000 a year. So with this case, we are talking about a product that falls into one of those right side quadrants. And depending on the value placed on these inflammatory markers that were used, it may be in the upper right quadrant, or it could be in that lower right quadrant of that matrix that we looked at. Regardless, efficacy is going to be the primary driver as payers look at value. But with that being said, payers will have questions to help them assess circumstances for coverage. So I'll turn it over to Pam to talk through how to address some of those challenging objections that may or may not have answers.
Okay, great. Thank you, Becky. So one of the questions is, how does this endpoint equate to clinical outcomes? So again, we're going back to sort of the use of surrogate endpoints, but also you can do some modeling of how those endpoints are predictive or a component of a more clinical outcome. And then you also want to potentially collaborate with your FDA and even with providers, because as I said, if it's not captured in standard medical practice, it might not be, you want to be able to make sure you have something that you can utilize when you go to payers and also to providers. So you want to have those conversations up front. As Becky said, there are in this fictitious condition, there are 3 subtypes. There's a type 1, type 2, type 3. Your study was in type 1. The FDA did not, so your label does not necessarily indicate a type, but they want to know, well, how many type 2 patients are there? So one thing is to do some sort of a prospective trial or a prospective observational trial, try to evaluate type 2 patients. The other is, because it is a rare disease, there may not be a diagnosis code. So possibly what you want to use is maybe there's some other approach. So there could be artificial intelligence and machine learning solutions. One thing that we do, actually one of our sister companies, 81QD, does is, in this case for patient finding, you're going to look for the patients that are diagnosed and look at their treatment journey and their diagnosis journey. And then what you're going to do is look for similar patients who have not been diagnosed. And that diagnosis may be identified through a SNOMED code, or maybe there's text in the EMR that they have a generic ICD-10 code, but there's but in ICD, the physician, you actually have the text description of what they have. So you look for those patients that don't have that, and any that are similar, you can say, you know what, these are very likely also type 2 patients or patients with this disease. that sort of answers both the, how many, type, would you happen to have type 2 patients, or even if your prevalence is an underestimate, or even it could be an overestimate. So you might want to look at some additional methodologies to try to figure out how many patients have those different types. The other thing is you might want to evaluate non-US data for extrapolation. Every country has their own modifications of diagnosis codes. So there may actually be a code, let's say in the German adaptation, or in the French adaptation. And you can utilize that data to extrapolate. The other thing that you could do too is to speak to providers who treat this condition and get estimates from them of their patient population as type 1, type 2, and type 3. And then again, we talk about medical costs. Here, you may want to, look at a payer mix, because those medical costs here could vary based on your population. Is it a Medicare population? Is it Medicaid? Maybe if it's a pediatric indication. So you want to be able to adjust your budget impact model for the different line of business that the payer may have. And also, again, claims analysis, or you may want to do some primary market research on the burden of illness.
All right.
Back to you, Becky, to sum up.
Yeah, so thanks everyone. And so today we walked through how consolidation and integration of the payer market provides both challenges as well as opportunities. We talked through several payer concerns for just to gain perspective on the issues that they are grappling with. We discussed how building a strong value proposition and then focusing on anticipating and strategizing data solutions to address payer objections can lead to increased market access for products. So we are going to pause here, see if there's any questions. Please feel free to submit them in the chat. I appreciate all the attention today.
So we've opened up the chat if anybody has any questions. I do have one off the top of my head. This has been something I've probably had 4 clients ask about this recently, if not more, around clinical guidelines and what that delicate balance is for you as a payer when you're looking at a product in the clinical study, but then it's not something that yet has been folded into clinical guidelines. Can you talk a little bit about that balance and the importance of becoming part of the standard, or if there's certain diseases where maybe that's not as important or others where it is?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things with guidelines. So just at a high level first, I think it's really important to understand the type of guideline that they are, right? There's different levels of evidence reviews. There's some of them are more consensus building types of guidelines. And so those will be evaluated through the whole process, looking at those guidelines, understanding what level of evidence they're using to support what's more opinion-based versus evidence-based. So that's an important factor, in understanding the level of recommendations that could be in guidelines. For things that are not addressed yet, and that's a common occurrence, right? Guidelines don't update as frequently as typically the drug market moves forward. And so it is there's a balance there of understanding some of the core principles even behind the guidelines and the approach to treatment. It may not specifically talk about that drug or even that class if it wasn't available, but there are some general principle understandings that can be pulled from those guidelines in terms of where you start and what you layer on and what are sort of the key targets of the disease, like the key treatment goals. So those can be used to help understand how this product adds value.
Okay, so we have a couple questions coming in. One other one is compendia. So drug compendia and the importance of that when manufacturers are trying to justify off-label use or putting data out there. How is that weighted relative to a guideline, or what's the importance of a compendia listing or strategy?
Yeah, so they definitely have weight, right? I mean, you think about something like NCCN, so for oncology products, National Cancer Comprehensive Network, clearly extremely important. Again, I think sometimes with the compendia, there's a level of, well, what type of evidence is there, that is supporting it, but definitely compendia are factored in to decisions because it's a good way of summarizing a lot of evidence that can be out there into a more consolidated, format. And then certainly with, like I mentioned, oncology, compendia, those are updated very frequently. And so those have a lot of value.
And a question for you, Pam and Becky. So in terms of when a client's in their clinical trial phase or moving past those phases and getting ready for launch, when would you recommend making sure that you've kind of buttoned up your evidence strategy, some of those publications, and then thinking through the development of that value proposition?
So my answer is it's never too early. But there are times maybe you've acquired an asset, right? So and as far as the development has gone to date, now you need to pick it up and do it. You want to have that list of what evidence you would like to have based on some anticipated questions, and then see what's reasonable to be done in the time that you have. And there are times that, as Becky said, you could just tell the payer, we don't have an answer to that just now. You can say what you have looked at to date, but offer that you will continue to look at it to provide that information going forward.
Yeah, and then I think to add on to that for the timing of like a payer value prop. So again, starting early is good, right? To start fine tuning those messages and what really resonates well with the clinical aspects. But any key discussion around a payer value proposition, you have to have a sense of what the price is going to be too, right? So price and clinical value are weighed together. So you have to at least have a sense of where the pricing is going to fall to really weigh those things out. But starting early with value messaging and getting feedback is a good place to start earlier on.
Those are all the questions that came in. If anyone has any follow-up questions, please do not hesitate to reach out. You can do that through the website, or we have the invites and everything, I think, sent you to us. We wanted to talk a little bit about the next month. So, when we set up these navigating market access with Magnolia sessions, we wanted to address all issues of market access. And as I've mentioned many times to many of our clients, to us, health economics, real world evidence, that generation all leads to market access. So this is a very interesting topic for a lot of people, is trying to figure out how to use real world data. And there's a lot of fancy things in data that, we're used to the claims, we're used to what files have been filled out, what we can pull data from. But now we have so much unstructured data that companies are trying to dig through and learn how to use and leverage in new and unique ways to advance their use of real world data. And we've been doing a ton of that work. We have a lot of great insights. We definitely invite you to come. Please enjoy or invite your colleagues that are involved in the data and the weeds on your medical affairs side or scientific interests. We'd love to have them join us. But this is definitely a great topic for us to talk about, the what to do with the data itself, how we work with it, and then how you can help think about it from a market access perspective. So thank you all for joining, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll see you next month.